Good morning. Welcome to today's webinar on the subject of ISO 45001. This standard was recently released, as we'll talk about. So this is ISO 45001 2018, and this will be an overview of the standard and changes from the previous similar standard that was in place. My name is Austin Matthews. I'm the EHS Assistant Program Manager at PJR. So welcome from myself and PJR. Today's audience, the webinar is open to anyone who's interested. So typically we see a combination of clients, potential clients, consultants, anyone who's looking to learn more about the standard. Sometimes we have some auditors join in for more information. So welcome to everyone who's joining us today. As far as an agenda, you can see on this slide, we'll talk a little bit about the services PJR offers, some reasons organizations seek this particular certification. We'll talk about the transition requirements for this ISO 45001 standard. We'll go through the key changes at a high level, and we'll also go a little more in-depth, clause by clause, looking at some of the key changes. We'll talk about a couple other related changes. We have some changes that coincide with the requirements for ISO 45001. So we'll talk briefly about those as far as its potential impact on organizations. At the end of the presentation, I'll go over the certification requirements, or what that process looks like for anyone who's not familiar, anyone who's looking to get certified for the first time. And we'll save time at the end for questions. So if at any point you think of questions, you can type them in the webinar questions section, and we will get to those at the end. This list gives you an idea of some of the countries in which PJR has certified companies to a wide variety of standards. It's not an all-inclusive list, but certainly gives you an idea that we have clients and locations around the world. Again, not an all-inclusive list, but we have we're accredited to grant certifications to a wide variety of standards, including the predecessor for ISO 45001, which was OSAS 18001, 2007, for those of you who are familiar with that standard. PJR is in the process of being accredited to ISO 45001 as well. And once we receive that accreditation, we can start granting certifications. It doesn't necessarily mean that we need to wait to conduct these audits, but we certainly need to be accredited before we can issue those certificates. So we'll talk more about that in a little while. In general, there are many benefits to getting certified to this and other standards. The requirements within the standard are certainly helpful in meeting legal requirements, identifying what those requirements are, and having processes and controls in place to maintain compliance with those requirements. Certainly improvements for the occupational health and safety performance of the organization with a management system adhering to the standard requirements. This provides a safe environment to do business in for employees and visitors, customers, other stakeholders. These management systems drive management commitment and employee engagement. It also can assist in meeting stakeholder requirements, provide an improved public image, achieve strategic objectives. And many of these standards are able to be integrated with other business management systems. A standard like this can also have an impact on supplier health and safety performance, can provide a competitive advantage. For example, being able to advertise that you hold this certification can sometimes provide an edge over your competitors. Minimizing the risks of production delays. And other financial benefits, sometimes there's a cost savings with liability insurance premiums if you have a certification to a health and safety standard like this. Drivers specific to this standard, above and beyond what we already talked about or somewhat redundantly, include that commitment to specifically the occupational health and safety of those employees or stakeholders, visitors, anyone that could be affected by the system, preventing those injuries, preventing ill health, really trying to create a safe work environment and having those controls in place to do so. Reducing the risks and hazards, like I said, for employees, contractors, visitors, anyone who might be on site or interacting with the services or processes. There are various business management drivers we already discussed, including public image and setting up that framework for meeting customer and or regulatory requirements. Those are some benefits of maintaining certification to the standard. As a general overview, ISO 45001-2018 replaces OSAS 18001-2007. So these are completely different standards in that OSAS was not an ISO standard. However, it does replace OSAS 18001. That will not be available anymore for certification to OSAS 18001. So now that this is released, ISO 45001-2018 is what we'll be using going forward. It defines the requirements for an occupational health and safety management system, or an OHSMS, which you'll see this abbreviation several times throughout my presentation. And that includes establishing the system, implementing the system, and maintaining it, going forward. So it's not a once and done thing. You really have to maintain it, improve it, certainly over time. The standard provides a framework to control hazards. We already talked about some of these as far as benefits of certification. So the point of this standard is identifying and controlling the hazards, reducing the risk associated with those hazards. So reducing the risk of accidents, injuries, ill health, or any other types of downtime, as well as continually improving the processes and the operation as a whole. The standard was recently published only last month, and it is a voluntary certification. However, as we already discussed, there are a variety of benefits to certification. As far as transitioning to ISO 45001 for clients who, for example, are already certified to OSAS 18001, there is a 3-year transition period from the publication date. So current or newly issued OSAS 18001 certificates, for example, if you have a recertification audit, they will reflect the expiration date of this 3-year transition. So even if you get recertified, say, next year, you're not ready to transition, so you recertify to OSAS 18001, you won't have the 3 years for that certificate as you normally would if it exceeds this 3-year transition deadline. So the expiration date would be, no later than that deadline. PGR will be issuing a transition plan to existing clients, which will give more detail as to what that deadline may look like based on the standards publication date of March 2018. Sometimes we set a deadline earlier than the transition period deadline in which we guarantee no lapse in certification. So what that means is that deadline, that transition period deadline to have your new certificate to ISO 45001 has to include time after your audit for resolving any nonconformities that might have been identified in your audit, obtaining acceptable corrective action responses, doing our own internal review as our normal process entails, and actually issuing those certificates after all of that has been completed. So we don't want anyone to be under the impression that you can have an audit right before this transition deadline without potentially having a lapse in certification. This process of resolving nonconformities and going through the review process can take a couple of months. Transition audits for ISO 45001 can occur during surveillance or recertification audits based on the client's preference. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a recertification audit during which you're making that transition. When the management system is ready, when client is ready to transition, we'll schedule that for whichever audit scheme it falls in. But we will add one audit day for verification of the transition requirements. This is a requirement trickled down from the certification requirements. So this is required that we add at least one day to the audit to make sure all of the transition requirements are verified, especially during a surveillance. There wouldn't be time for that otherwise. And even with a recertification audit, there are requirements in addition to what OSAS 18001 had that we need to make sure we have enough time to review before we issue that new certificate for ISO 45001. So we'll be adding at least one day. That's something to be aware of. With ISO 45001 being an ISO standard, unlike the OSAS 18001 standard we previously used, it now reflects the Annex SL structure, as do the other revised ISO standards, such as ISO 14001 2015 and ISO 9001 2015, for those of you who may be familiar with those standards. And this is really in part to make integration easier so that they're following the same format using similar terms. So this may look familiar to many of you. We also still have the Plan, Do, Check, Act model. It's found within the standard. So at a very high level, key changes in ISO 45001 compared to OSAS 18001 2007. I already mentioned the adoption of the ISO structure of the previous two slides. There's a definite emphasis on leadership in these new ISO standards. So ISO 45001 being one of those, there's an emphasis on leadership. And we'll talk more about that in the coming slides. There's also a focus on risk management, emphasizing objective measurement and change, trying to drive continual improvement. More requirements around communication and awareness. And there are fewer prescriptive requirements. So there are additional requirements in this revision of the standard. However, they're usually less prescriptive than in previous versions of the standard, giving clients more flexibility in how they meet those requirements. As it varies by industry or company size, it gives more flexibility. I'm not going to go through all the terms within the standard. I tried to highlight a couple that had changed. So interested party is one of the newer ISO terms. It's also known as a stakeholder. That may be more familiar to some of you as a previously used term. So that's one definition to take a look at. And this helps align with the Annex SL structure we talked about before. The occupational health and safety management system, not a new definition. However, there's a note added about intended outcomes. So one of the changes with the standard is a focus on whether or not it's meeting the intended outcomes of the system, which are defined here to prevent injury and ill health to workers and to provide safe and healthy workplaces. And some of those terms have their own definitions, but this is an important concept, the intended outcomes, and you'll hear this come up again. So those are the intended outcomes of the OHSMS. Top management is defined, and this is important. As I mentioned, there's an emphasis on management, involvement, commitment, responsibility. So the top management definition is important. Risk is an important definition. You can see there's several notes. And all of these are found within the standard, so you can take a look at these outside of this webinar. Other than the definition for risk, it goes on to further define specifically an occupational health and safety risk as it relates to the potential for injury and ill health. There are also opportunities, and this is an improvement. So where risks are likely negative, opportunities are positive. And this is a new concept as well in the revised ISO structures. Competence is defined, and this is an important concept as well in the revised standard. Documented information replaces some of the previous terms like documents and records to again allow more flexibility in what that means to an organization as an individual. As it says here, it can be in any format or media, again, giving a greater level of flexibility. Occupational health and safety performance is an important concept similar to intended outcomes. We're looking for improvement of performance. Audit is defined with several notes. Not a new definition, but there are some changes. Strategic management is defined as there's some references within the standard to strategic planning. And that's one of the more significant changes overall, making sure the planning, the strategy of the management system aligns with the controls or the performance, that it's all matching and leading to that strategic direction. As I said, there's an emphasis on leadership as far as one of the key changes in ISO 45001. So it actually, leadership has its own clause in this new structure, assigning specific responsibilities for people in leadership roles, making sure that the health and safety management system isn't only one person's responsibility and that it's promoted throughout the organization in the hopes of having a more successful management system. ISO 45001 also calls for a greater level of proactivity. So we're really looking for companies to be proactive in their identification of risks, their control of risks and hazards, trying to protect the workers and other interested parties, not so much reacting to incidents, injuries, or even near misses, but being proactive in identifying them and minimizing or eliminating them before anyone gets hurt. And in terms of OHS performance, as I said, there's a shift emphasizing the improvement of the performance of the system or performance as it relates to health and safety, less emphasis on improving the system itself. So less focused on the documentation and what that means to the management system and where can we make improvements, but driving improvement in general or as a whole, driving improvements to the performance as it relates to health and safety. And again, you can take a look at that definition to tie those concepts together. There's some changes to the communication requirements as far as putting equal emphasis on external and internal communications and clarifying some of the requirements within that section. We already talked about how documentation requirements have been expanded to reference documented information and give greater flexibility as to how that documented information is maintained. So looking a little more in depth at some of the clauses within the standard where there were more changes. Again, we're not going to go through every single clause, but I try to highlight the more significant changes here. So in the first clause, again, we have a new structure to the standard. The first clause relates to context of the organization, which may be a new term for many of you if you haven't been going through the ISO transition for some of the other standards. But what that context is, you can find that in the definition section, but really trying to determine the relevant issues, internal and external to the management system, or as they're relevant to the management system, that could impact its ability to achieve those intended outcomes that we talked about earlier. So those issues could be internal or external to the organization, but if they are relevant to the management system or have that ability to affect the intended outcomes, then they are relevant. So you want to determine what those are. You also want to determine the needs or expectations of interested parties, not just your employees, as those usually or often translate into requirements that need to be built into the system. And once you've identified these internal and external issues and the needs and expectations of interested parties, those should be taken into consideration as well when determining the scope. The next clause deals with leadership and worker participation. As I said, leadership has its own clause now. So we're talking about how top management takes on more accountability and responsibility for the management system, for the effectiveness of the management system, for the adequacy of resources and the allocation of resources, communication of relevant information, and the integration of the OH&S requirements into other business processes. The concept of a health and safety policy is not new. However, there's revised verbiage requiring the policy and objectives to be aligned with the strategic direction, and we touched on that topic earlier, and also aligned with achieving the system's intended outcomes, whatever they may be specific to the organization. The policy should also include a commitment to participation, and that is a term that's defined, relates to worker participation and the involvement of employees and other relevant workers. As I said, top management needs to ensure adequate responsibilities and resources. This includes delegating as appropriate. Top management is allowed to delegate those responsibilities. However, they have to maintain accountability. A management representative is no longer required or even mentioned explicitly. So the expectation is no longer that one individual is necessarily responsible or accountable for all of these requirements. top management is the term that's emphasized instead. Participation and consultation of workers, both of these terms are defined. And the criteria here is a bit more prescriptive and specific compared to OSAS 18001 in terms of what needs to be identified within the processes for participation and consultation, such as the methods for achieving participation and consultation, what training requirements there may be, what resource requirements may be, looking at what obstacles may be at play, keeping people from participating, fear of reprisal, language barriers, if there are ramifications to employees reporting concerns or raising concerns or expressing where improvements could be made, then obviously people are going to be less inclined to voice those or participate in that way. So really looking at minimizing or removing any barriers that may be in place. And that's just one example, obviously. Participation and consultation across the board, not just managers. And this, as always, includes the concepts of identification of risks and hazards. Employees working in those areas are often more aware of where the risks may be or aware of other risks, different risks from being on the floor doing those jobs every day. We may have a good idea where those risks are, but that doesn't mean we're thinking of everything or that the risks have been necessarily rated correctly or as appropriately as possible. So it's really beneficial to involve employees in this process. Also in the identification of operational controls, investigating incidents, determining the needs and expectations of interested parties, what monitoring and measurement methods may be appropriate. There are a variety of topics in which participation and consultation should be utilized. Clause 6 covers planning, and this section has been completely restructured. So planning and risk determination need to really be taken into consideration, including those positive opportunities we talked about earlier, as well as the issues, the internal and external issues that were identified earlier in the context section of the standard, and similarly the needs and expectations of interested parties. So when looking at risk, when planning how to address risks and hazards, it's a reminder that all of these things need to be considered and factored into this process at a high level. And again, we're focused on achieving those intended outcomes. So there's some verbiage changes here, what exactly needs to be determined, a little bit more about risks and opportunities, what they may be related to. Again, in terms of hazard identification and controlling hazards, we're looking for a greater level of proactivity. So some things to think about here when going through the hazard identification process, things that maybe are not always considered, people in the nearby area who can be affected by the organization's processes, activities, or services, or their health and safety performance. Who else could be affected? Not limiting the consideration to the people necessarily within the building. Also thinking about people in the workplace not necessarily controlled by the organization. Sometimes there are companies located within the same space or outsourced work going on within the facility. Sometimes there is outsourced labor, for example, where temps are brought in, and sometimes the definition of how they're controlled is a little bit muddy, but making sure that if they're in the workplace or affected by those activities, they're being considered. Work areas and equipment designs can be considered. Changes or proposed changes should be considered if they have an effect on the management system, the health and safety side of things. Past incidents should be considered. There's a variety of topics recommended. We already talked about risk, so having a process to assess what those risks are, as well as giving applicable criteria to the risk level or the severity or whatever the process looks like for taking those risks and determining how they're going to be managed. Obviously, all of this should be maintained in some format as documented information, as evidence of the outputs of this process. And the criteria should be clear and established. Again, remembering that we're looking for proactivity here. The standard is looking for proactivity. Similarly, when we're talking about risks, we have to remember on the other end of the spectrum, we're being asked to identify opportunities as well, and that's that positive impact. So remembering to assess and include those positive opportunity potentials as well when relevant to the health and safety performance. Determining applicable legal and other requirements. This is not a new concept, but we do want to make sure we have up-to-date determination of what those requirements are, as well as up-to-date access to the requirements to understand what they entail and monitor for changes. Not only should you be determining what requirements are applicable, you should also be determining how they apply to your specific organization. You know, what those requirements mean, what that regulation, for example, means you actually need to do. And sometimes this varies by industry or employee count or facility size or what wastes are being generated, but taking that regulation verbiage and understanding how it applies to you and how those operational controls, what they need to reflect. This goes hand in hand with determining what, if any, communication requirements are related to those legal and other requirements. And keep in mind, legal and other requirements are one of those areas where we may see risks and opportunities be identified. Once these items are identified, the risks, the opportunities, the legal and other requirements, then we need to plan action accordingly. So taking into account those items or planning to address them, as well as emergency situations, how we're going to evaluate effectiveness, not forgetting about the hierarchy of controls, which was in OSAS 18001, 2007 as well, and other system outputs. And the hierarchy of controls, for anyone who is not familiar, relates to different levels of controls, such as using personal protective equipment like hard hats, safety glasses, using documented procedures or work instructions versus utilizing actual engineering or engineered controls such as machine guards. There's a hierarchy of controls based on severity of the risk or the ease of preventing access to those hazards. That's what the hierarchy of controls is referencing, and that can be found within the standard. Getting back to improvement of the occupational health and safety performance, obviously we still have objective requirements. So there are requirements spelled out as to what these need to include. They need to be consistent with the policy, take into consideration the legal and other requirements, the risks and opportunities we just discussed, the results of the participation and consultation efforts we discussed earlier. They need to be monitored, ideally measured if that's possible, and that varies based on what specific objectives you identify. They certainly need to be communicated what those objectives are, how they're going to be achieved, how things are going, the status of those objectives based on the performance being tracked or monitored, and be updated as relevant. So as you're making progress or you're having issues or you're needing to change directions, all of those should be updated. And again, having a plan to achieve those objectives, there are various things you need to determine, and this is spelled out in the standard. Looking for documented information as evidence of having determined these things. So it has to be documented in some way, shape, or form to be able to show an auditor or anyone else how these have been determined. What specific tasks or actions will it take to achieve the objective? Any resource needs? Who's responsible? What kind of deadlines or timelines are we looking at for the various tasks and the objective as a whole? How and when will the results be monitored or measured? How will the results be evaluated to know whether you met the objective or not? How will this affect the rest of the management system, or how will these objectives be integrated? All of those things should be determined. Clause 7 relates to support. Competency and awareness is one piece of this particular clause. They are now separated into two sections, whereas previously they were combined. So we see a section about competency and a separate section about awareness. And the awareness section is expanded upon, a little more prescriptive or specific compared to OSAS 18001. Communication is expanded upon as well, and external reporting controls, so we'll get into that a little bit more. We already did talk about documented information as a term, so this would have been a section that talked about record keeping in previous versions, so you'll see documented information come up again. And this is really just to try and keep up with changing technologies. So as I said, competence has its own section, determining what those competency requirements are for workers that can affect the performance of the OHSMS. And that workers, when you take a look at that definition, that can mean a variety of things. And we also need to see evidence through documented information of the different workers meeting those competency requirements. So if action is needed to meet the competency requirements, that also needs to be taken care of. If there's a gap between a worker in a given role, what competencies they already have versus what is needed for that role, we need to see what those actions are to close that gap, as well as evaluating the effectiveness of those actions, whether it's training, for example, not the only example to be sure, but let's say training is needed. We're looking for documented information of that training, evaluation of the effectiveness of that training, and whether the competency requirements are now being met. Awareness is more specific in terms of what specific topics workers need to be made aware of by the organization, including the real or potential ramifications of deviating from the various requirements of the management system. So They need to be aware of what could happen if those controls aren't followed, for example, or if the legal and other requirements are deviated from. Communication is broken down by internal and external requirements. There's really not a significant change in the internal communication, so I didn't include that here. External communication, just making sure that relevant interested party views are taken into consideration as far as what needs to be communicated when. This is an area where those interested party needs and expectations need to be taken into consideration, as well as at a high level determining what needs to be communicated. And that is pretty specific. When we're talking about communication requirements, we're looking for who is communicating what to which organizations, when or how frequently is this required, what's the methodology for communicating this information as you've deemed relevant. Here's where we see the specific clause related to documented information and how that will be controlled. It's very similar to the previous requirements related to document controls and record controls, in that the controls need to be identified, and the creating, updating, and controlling of the documented information has to be a process put in place. But the documented information term is new in relation to the flexibility that organizations will have in using different types of media formats. Clause 8 relates to operations. We go from planning and control to eliminating hazards, management of change. So we need to have established processes for the actions that we take, and ensuring that the criteria are met. There aren't specific or significant changes in terms of eliminating hazards or reducing risk. However, there is a specific section related to management of change. Management of change requirement isn't new. It was found in OSAS 18001. It wasn't as clearly defined and described, however. So now we have a separate section related to controlling planned changes that can affect the OHSMS or the performance, the health and safety performance. And that's planned changes as well as unplanned changes, but obviously the intent here is to be planning changes before they are implemented, before new equipment is brought on site, before new chemicals are purchased and utilized, in the warehouse, to plan out those changes that can affect the OHSMS, to identify the risks, mitigate any negative impact potentials, have the controls in place before the change is made. So some examples might include new products, changes to services or processes that the organization offers, a difference in working conditions, new equipment, changing legal requirements. Those are just a couple examples. But again, being proactive in managing those risks before the risk is introduced into the OHSMS. There are separate sections for procurement related to outsourced processes or purchasing, and a separate section for contractors. So in terms of procurement, we're looking for processes and controls for whenever something is outsourced that could affect the health and safety performance, whether it's work done on site or off site. If it's outsourced, it's still relevant to the management system and its potential impact there. Similarly, contractors, we're looking to make sure organizations are identifying and controlling any risks related to the contractor's work, whether it's the specific activities the contractors are performing, their potential impact on the other workers at the organization, or the potential impact of the organization's workers on the contractors doing work in those areas, or an impact on their activities. So really looking at, again, being proactive, looking at the potential impacts there. We also want to make sure that the criteria for selecting contractors is identified and controlled, and that there are processes also to ensure the activities of those contractors are meeting the requirements of the health and safety system. So not just vetting contractors, but actually overseeing their activities, making sure the controls are being adhered to, their performance, their health and safety controls are in line with the health and safety requirements of the organization. We already talked a little bit about outsourcing, but as well, we're looking for controls to make sure any materials that are procured, again, meet the requirements of the management system, similar to the contractor requirements we just discussed. If something's being purchased, ensuring that the intended outcomes are met, the system requirements are met through those procurement processes. Not a huge change when it comes to emergency preparedness and response requirements. There are some additions to this section, things to be considered or included in the emergency response process or plan. Something to think about or include would be reviewing the procedures after a drill or an emergency situation to make sure the processes or the procedures were appropriate, that they were effective, to identify if any changes need to be made. Sometimes performing drills or having an evacuation type event or some other type of emergency situation can identify issues with the process as written or the need for revisions or changes in some capacity. So that's part of the point of doing the drills, testing the system, not just testing the awareness of the employees or the effectiveness of the training of those processes, but also making sure that the process for evacuation, for example, or the different emergency situations that have been identified, making sure those processes are appropriate and they're going to be effective and work as expected in the case of an actual emergency. You should also make sure that the emergency response processes include any training that may be relevant, and also make sure all interested parties are considered as relevant. So if there are other people potentially affected by an emergency type situation at the organization's facility, do they have other needs or capabilities that haven't been considered yet? Clause 9 deals with performance evaluation. So first, we're looking at monitoring and measuring to identify the performance and evaluate the performance of the OHSMS. So determining what monitoring and measurement requirements are, again, specific to who's monitoring what, how often, what frequency, what are the methods for monitoring and measurement, how will it be done, all of that to be determined, as well as evaluating the actual performance and effectiveness. So how specifically is that going to be done? Internal audits are an important way to evaluate performance as well. So the internal audit program needs to include and identify specific factors identified within the standard, spelled out pretty clearly what it needs to include. This section also requires that results of the audits be reported to relevant managers, workers, and or relevant worker representatives and other interested parties. So again, coming back to greater communication expectations, the results of these audits should be communicated as they reflect the performance of the system, really looking at who else needs to be made aware of this information. Management review is another monitoring methodology, a way to review the system and its performance. So there are some additional criteria or inputs and outputs in this section of the standard compared to OSAS 18001. And again, it's pretty clear. The standard is telling you what specifically needs to be discussed at those meetings as an input, or what discussions or decisions need to come out of these meetings to meet the requirements of the standard. And again, we see here an emphasis on top management. So really, we're looking for this top management definition to match with who's participating in these meetings, that the relevant top management individuals are making themselves available for these meetings, that they are participating, they are accountable, they are aware, all those things we talked about earlier related to top management participation. The last clause relates to improvement in general. The standard requires opportunities for improvement to be identified, which is, again, in sync with the proactivity requirements of this standard, or the tone of this standard. So opportunities for improvements, again, being more proactive, not necessarily waiting for an incident to occur or an issue to be identified through an audit nonconformity through a third party, or an actual nonconformity situation, but trying to be more proactive and identify where things can be improved upon. Again, nonconformities, incident and corrective actions are not new concepts, but there are some new requirements, such as prompts to ensure actions are taken in a timely manner. So if an incident occurs or a nonconformity is identified, looking for timely actions to address those issues, to contain them, to remove the root cause, prevent recurrence. It's certainly concerning if there's a large amount of time going by between the time an issue is identified and when it's effectively root caused, for example, or when the appropriate parties are all gathered to do a formal incident investigation. There shouldn't be a significant amount of time going by between those two things. And once the investigation has taken place, we're also looking for actions to be implemented in a timely manner. So as well, not just the incident investigation piece, but what's going to be done, how will it be contained, what's the corrective action to address that root cause and prevent recurrence, and implementing those in a timely manner. We're also looking for evaluation of effectiveness for any corrective actions taken. So you want to implement that change as well as go back to verify that it was effective in addressing the issue in the first place. So sometimes this verification can be done pretty soon after implementation. Other times we need to wait a while for perhaps the situation to be relevant again, or to see a little bit more of a lasting impact, but certainly looking for that effectiveness to be verified with evidence through documented information. So again, you're going to need some type of documented information to show an auditor or another individual that these actions were performed. And again, circling back to communication requirements, as relevant, these results should also be communicated to workers, worker representatives, other interested parties. So again, the tones of the standard include communication of relevant information and the proactive approach to make sure you're identifying and controlling the risks or hazards and other situations that can affect the performance and the intended outcomes of the management system. Continual improvement is certainly still found in the standard, improving performance overall, maintaining a culture that supports the health and safety management system and what it's trying to achieve, encouraging participation of workers, communicating results to relevant parties, and maintaining evidence of the actions and improvements taken through documented information. This is sort of a summary, if you will, of a variety of the topics we've discussed, and that's the last clause of the standard, the last piece, really making sure that not only are these requirements implemented, but they're maintained and improved upon over time. There are a couple references included at the end of the standard. I'm not going to go into detail as to those, but Annex A includes guidance on how to use the standard, maybe elaborating on the requirements or how they could be implemented. And there's obviously a bibliography at the end of the standard. Very briefly, I know we're running short on time, but I wanted to go over a couple other related changes to the standard. This affects certification bodies more than clients, but there's a couple changes I wanted to make you aware of. As we migrate to ISO 45001, these requirements will come into play as well. So one thing to know is that you'll be required to notify PJR of significant changes related to the system, and we're looking for notification in writing in a timely manner. So you don't want to sit on these changes or wait until the next audit to communicate them to the certification body. In our case, that would be us, that would be PJR. If you contract with another certification body, the requirement will be the same. So we're looking for notification in writing of significant changes. I believe significant changes is one of the defined terms as well. We do have a prescribed audit timetable that we will have to take into account or revise our processes to reflect. And this may change your audit time requirements. We talked a lot about top management accountability and participation. So when we were talking about management review and making themselves available for those types of meetings, that also includes our external audits. So if you're being audited for your ISO 45001 certification, when we have that closing meeting, we're also looking for top management to be in attendance for that meeting as well, as one method of demonstrating that accountability and participation. If they're not present, we'd be looking for a reason as to why, and we'll be asking our auditors to document that as well. CB's certification bodies such as PJR may in some situations conduct special audits to respond to or investigate compliance issues, incidents, etc. And these requirements are found in your terms and conditions, but I just want to make you aware of that. It does happen from time to time, and certificates can even be suspended or withdrawn related to compliance issues, health and safety incidents. That's dealt with on a case-by-case basis, and it can be found in the terms and conditions. And those are requirements that trickle down again from these documents listed above to the certification bodies like PJR. Same goes for legal compliance violations or gaps. When you're initially seeking certification, that could be something that impedes the process. Overall, these documents combined with ISO 45001, the revised standard, really raises the bar for the performance expectations of the management system as a whole. So briefly, for any new or prospective clients who would be seeking certification to ISO 45000 for the first time, not just transitioning from OSAS 18001, the process is pretty straightforward. You're going to establish the documentation internally or with the help of a consultant to meet the requirements of the standard. You'll perform any training that's required, implement the requirements themselves that the documentation calls out. That includes conducting an internal audit, a compliance evaluation, a review, like a management review based on the results of the internal audit and all of the other prescribed inputs and outputs. You'll want to contract with a certification body such as PJR. We can provide quotes as to audit time and different expenses and give you an idea of what that looks like. And then you would enter into a contract. And then you would complete 2 audits to obtain your certification initially. It's a stage 1 audit and a stage 2 audit. I'll go into a little more detail about that. Address any resulting nonconformities before a certificate could be issued. So these audits in particular, that's what they're what make up our registration process. So we have the stage 1 audit, which is essentially a documentation review to ensure you're ready to move on to stage 2, which would happen fairly shortly after your stage 1, give you time to address any concerns if they were identified. But this audit constitutes the audit of the entire OHSMS. The process audits, are you doing what you say you'll do in your documents, and are you effectively meeting the requirements of the standard? So this would cover all processes, likely all shifts if you have more than one shift. Any nonconformities that come out of the stage 2 do need to be resolved prior to receiving a certificate. But after that, a certificate would be issued, valid for 3 years, during which you have surveillance audits. They can be semi-annual or annual. They're partial system audits, so covering about half of what would be covered during the stage 2 audit, so that between the two, the processes are covered. And on that 3rd year, like I said, the certificates are good for 3 years. You'd have your recertification audit again, very similar to the stage 2 audit in that it's a full system audit and would result in a new certificate good for another 3 years. So you don't have to complete that stage 1 audit again unless your certificate is withdrawn at some point for whatever reason, failure to close findings or business downturn, and you want to voluntarily stop certification. Otherwise, you would not have to repeat that stage 1 audit again. And that's a brief overview of what the 3-year cycle looks like. If you have more than one location doing the same activity and you want them to be included on the same certificate, that would be a multi-site situation, and we can do some sampling of the sites. We can look at that in more detail at the quoting and contract phase, if that's something that would be relevant to your organization. As I said, the standard can be integrated with other standards such as ISO 14001. So again, at the quoting stage, if that's something that is relevant to you, we could talk about that. And I put this detail in the slides so that you can review them after the webinar. The slides will be made available on PJR's website, usually within a day. That's something that you can review in more detail if it's applicable to you. And our salespeople could certainly go through that as well. Okay, sorry for going a couple minutes over. I'm going to check the question tab, see if anyone has any questions. In the meantime, I'm going to put our contact information on this slide here on the screen. So certainly with any questions about this presentation, the standard, or any of the other EHS topics you can think of, you can contact myself or the EHS program manager, Nancy Bednars. Her contact information is listed here as well. If you're a prospective client and you're interested in obtaining a quote, here's the contact for our sales department. If you are currently certified to OSAS 18001 and you're looking to schedule your transition to ISO 45001, that would be done through contacting your scheduler. So let's see with the time that we have left if anyone has any questions. Okay, so one question we have, is it required to give classroom training to external providers on risks of the organization? If I'm understanding the question correctly, you're asking if, let's say you have contractors coming on site or some other affected interested parties, if you have to have a formal training going on related to risks. I apologize if I'm not understanding the question, but in that case, not necessarily. The standard really gives you the control as to what competencies or what awareness requirements you have and the methodologies you're going to utilize to close the gap between what you're requiring them to be aware and competent of and the competencies that they already have. The methodology for how you close that gap is up to the organization. As long as you are able to have that documented information as evidence, you evaluate the effectiveness afterwards of that communication and it's proving effective, there's not one specific way that needs to be performed. What is PJR's timeline for becoming ready to certify businesses that will be implementing ISO 45001 as a new standard? So the accreditation process, I don't have a specific timeline. We do hope to be accredited by fourth quarter or to be able to be doing audits by fourth quarter of this year. So you can certainly start with a contracting process at this point. And as I said, it's sometimes possible to be conducting audits prior to that accreditation. If we're nearing the end of that process, by the time the audit would be over, we would be accredited to be able to issue that certificate. So that's an option as well. Will PJR offer a training for client leaders similar to the R2 internal auditor course? As far as I'm aware, we're still discussing the training that we will put out. So the webinar is the first point. We'll be repeating this webinar on a quarterly basis and we'll update it as we receive other information. Going through the accreditation process, we'll also be required to train our auditors, our internal, PJR's auditors to this standard. As far as offering an internal auditor course for ISO 45001, that I will have to check on. I can certainly make that suggestion or inquire about that. If you want to send me an email with that specific question so I know who to respond to once I receive an answer, that would be great. Will this presentation be made available to attendees today? Yes. The slides will be available on the website within a day on PJR's website under previously recorded webinars. There will be a recording of the slides as well as the voice recording of the webinar. We also have a different part on the website if you're just looking for the slides. I believe it's past slides or previous webinar slides. So those will be made available on the PJR website. See, for the migration process, if the company is certified to ISO 18001, do we have to be audited for the stage 1? No. If you're transitioning from OSAS 18001 to ISO 45001, as I said in some of the earlier slides about the transition, that can happen during a surveillance or a recertification audit. So wherever you are in the cycle, we would just add the transition time to that audit when you're ready to transition. You don't need to start over with a stage one. I'm just going through to see if are you providing any transition certificate on ISO 45000-2018? I'm not sure I understand that question. The certificates would be revised. As I said, when you have your transition audit, you'd be receiving a revised certificate. So you'd be issued a new certificate, or a revised certificate, I should say, after your transition audit, reflecting the ISO 45001 audit. If it's a surveillance audit, it will reflect the same expiration date as the previous OSAS certificate. It doesn't start a new 3-year cycle unless you are transitioning during a recertification audit. So you would certainly be receiving a revised certificate after your transition audit. There's a question about methodologies for how risks and opportunities will be evaluated. I'm unclear if you're asking how an external auditor will be evaluating those processes, or how an organization is expected to evaluate those risks and opportunities. Like I said, the requirements for what's to be considered is found in the standard. It's not incredibly prescriptive in that it gives you flexibility in how you will do that. As far as how our auditors will evaluate that, we're still going through the accreditation process. We will be revising our audit reports to reflect the new standard requirements, and we'll be training our auditors. So I can't exactly say at this time how it would be evaluated. There's another question about risks and opportunities as to whether it's mandatory to analyze them. So the standard does require in several locations that risks and opportunities be determined and documented. So I would say, if I'm understanding correctly, yes, it is mandatory. Okay, I think that's all of our questions today. If anyone thinks of any additional questions, or I've misunderstood something that you've asked, please feel free to contact me at the email address on the screen. Otherwise, take a look at the slides when they're posted on the website. Again, we'll be repeating this webinar each quarter this year, so we'll have at least 2 more this year. This was the second webinar of the year for this topic. We will keep it updated as far as our status in the accreditation process. Currently certified clients can keep an eye out for the transition plans to come out from PJR as well. And thank you for joining me today, and I hope your transition goes smoothly when you get to that point. And I hope you have a great day.